The sun hung low over Copper Ridge, its dusty rays turning the wooden facades of the town into glowing amber. The wind whispered across the empty streets, carrying the faint sound of a piano from the saloon, mingling with the distant clatter of horseshoes against weathered planks. Children ran barefoot between the boards, their laughter echoing through the narrow alleys, oblivious to the darkness creeping ever closer. Sheriff Elias Crowe sat on the jailhouse railing, rolling his revolver in his calloused hands. Years of keeping law in the Wild West had taught him patience, the value of silence, and the weight of a heavy conscience. He had witnessed greed, betrayal, and death too many times, yet the feeling in the air made his fingers tighten around the leather grip of his gun. Something was coming, something that would test every ounce of skill he had honed over decades. From the corner of the street, a sudden explosion shattered the mid-afternoon calm. Glass flew into the sunlit air as smoke roared from the town bank. The sound of screams joined the crackle of flames, blending into a chaotic symphony of terror. Sheriff Crowe leapt to his feet, heart hammering, and ran toward the bank. Emerging from the smoke, a gang of masked men dashed into the streets, sacks of gold in their hands, their boots kicking up clouds of dust. Leading them was Vincent "Viper" Kane, a man whose reputation sent chills through every lawman and townsfolk in the frontier. His movements were precise, confident, and terrifyingly swift. Within minutes, the gang disappeared as if swallowed by the desert itself. Crowe stepped over shattered wood and scattered coins, surveying the devastation. Then he noticed it, a small note, pinned to the ruined safe with a dagger. "Catch me if you can. V." Crowe's jaw tightened. This was more than a robbery. This was a personal challenge from a criminal who thrived on outsmarting lawmen. "I've been waiting for someone like him my whole life," Crowe muttered. Crowe mounted his horse outside the smoldering bank. Dust rose behind him as he spurred the stallion forward, racing toward the horizon. Every abandoned shack, every canyon, every dry riverbed could hide Kane. This pursuit would test not only his skill but also his wit, courage, and understanding of human nature. As he rode, memories of the last town Kane had struck washed over him. A widow, crying over her stolen savings. A child screaming for the father who would never return. Crowe's eyes burned with the fire of determination. "This ends," he whispered under his breath. The landscape unfolded like a living canvas. Golden plains stretched to jagged mountains on the horizon. Scattered mesas cast long shadows over dry riverbeds. Crowe's horse galloped tirelessly, hoofs drumming a relentless rhythm against the hard earth. The wind carried the smell of leather, smoke, and dust, mingling with the faint scent of distant pine from higher ridges. Along the way, Crowe passed abandoned homesteads, their weathered wood gray from years under the scorching sun. Windows were shattered, doors hung on hinges, and every step echoed the stories of families who had left or vanished. These structures whispered secrets, some perhaps set by Kane himself to confuse and mislead any pursuers. Hours passed. Crowe slowed his horse at a narrow canyon pass called Devil's Creek, a natural choke point notorious for ambushes. Every movement was cautious, every shadow suspicious. He could see the faint traces of tire marks, hoof prints, and footprints, subtle clues left behind by Kane's gang. The sheriff dismounted and examined the ground, noting the patterns carefully. Kane was meticulous, deliberate, and clever. Crowe felt a twinge of respect, just enough to remind him of the cunning opponent he faced. As night fell, Crowe found a ridge overlooking the canyon. He set up a small camp, lighting a controlled fire to keep warm and keeping his horse nearby, tethered to a rock. He reviewed the clues he had collected during the day, the faint feathers stuck in the soil, the broken branch overhanging the path, the subtle drag marks of heavy sacks of stolen gold. Crowe's mind replayed the robbery repeatedly, analyzing every movement, every timing, every escape route. Kane was more than a thief. He was a strategist, a predator who understood both geography and human psychology. Sleep was impossible. The wind carried strange sounds, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustling of unseen creatures. Every noise set Crowe's senses on edge. He trained his eyes on the shadows, hand hovering over his revolver. Then, a faint glimmer in the moonlight caught his eye. Something moving quickly along a ridge across the canyon. Could it be Kane? Or merely a wild animal? Crowe squinted. The figure was deliberate, moving with confidence, a human gait unmistakable even in the darkness. He mounted his horse silently and pursued, following the faint outline across the rocky terrain. The chase was on. The night became a canvas of shadows, cliffs, and echoes. Every step, every movement mattered. The desert seemed to close in, and Crowe understood the dangerous dance he had entered. He recalled stories of Kane's previous robberies, small towns terrorized, lawmen outsmarted, and traps that left pursuers trapped or worse. Crowe knew this hunt would test every skill he had: patience, cunning, precision, and courage. As dawn approached, Crowe finally spotted faint hoof and foot tracks leading toward a long-abandoned settlement called Lone Pine. The ghost town had been deserted for decades, its wooden structures leaning precariously, windows shattered, and wind whistling through the empty streets. Kane had used this place as a hideout before, Crowe was certain of it. He dismounted cautiously, scanning the shadows. Every step was calculated. Every noise, creaking wood, shifting stones, might reveal a trap. And then, from the alleyway, a soft metallic clang echoed. Crowe's hand went to his revolver instinctively. His pulse quickened. Kane was close. The chase had begun in earnest, and the deadly cat-and-mouse game between Sheriff Elias Crowe and Vincent Viper Kane had officially begun. This was only the first strike. The frontier was about to witness a battle of wits, courage, and survival unlike any it had ever seen. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the jagged cliffs of Devil's Creek, painting the canyon in shades of gold and crimson. Sheriff Elias Crowe crouched behind a boulder, surveying the landscape. The tracks he had followed through the night led deeper into treacherous terrain, a labyrinth of narrow ridges, dry riverbeds, and hidden gullies. Each footprint, each broken twig, each dragged coin bag told him a story. Kane was clever, leaving clues only for someone meticulous enough to follow them. Crowe's horse pawed at the rocky soil, restless, sensing the tension in the air. The sheriff brushed sweat from his brow. He knew Kane was not merely fast or lucky, he was strategic. Every town, every road, every isolated homestead along the frontier was part of Kane's intricate web. To catch him, Crowe would have to think like the outlaw. The canyon walls echoed the distant calls of birds and the occasional howl of a coyote. The stillness of the morning was deceptive. One misstep could mean death. Crowe tightened his grip on his revolver and scanned the ridges. Shadows shifted in the corner of his vision, perhaps wild animals, perhaps traps. Kane had a habit of using decoys to throw pursuers off his trail. Hours passed. Crowe moved cautiously, following the faint drag marks and hoof prints through dry washes and across steep, sun-baked slopes. He paused at a narrow wooden bridge that spanned a deep chasm. The boards were old, splintered, and rattling in the wind. Across it, he glimpsed movement, a shadow of a man disappearing toward the canyon beyond. Crowe raised his revolver and fired, the shot echoing against the cliffs. Dust and splinters erupted where the figure had been, but it was a decoy. Kane had vanished, leaving Crowe momentarily blinded by the clever ruse. Frustration bubbled in Crowe's chest, but he did not falter. He examined the broken bridge carefully. Small scratches on the boards, scuff marks in the dirt, trivial details that revealed more than a novice could decipher. Kane had led him here intentionally, testing his observation, his patience, and his resolve. The sheriff took a deep breath. The game had truly begun. By midday, Crowe reached a narrow canyon pass where the sun beat down mercilessly. He spotted signs of recent activity, footprints partially washed out by the wind, a torn piece of cloth snagged on a branch, and a faint feather stuck in the soil. Kane was methodical, leaving enough evidence to entice his pursuers while concealing his true path. Crowe followed the subtle clues, knowing each step brought him closer, but also deeper into potential danger. As evening approached, Crowe set up camp on a ridge overlooking a dry wash. He tied his horse to a nearby juniper tree and examined the tracks once more. The faint trails suggested that Kane planned to use Lone Pine, a ghost town abandoned decades earlier, as a temporary hideout. The town's dilapidated buildings and broken windows made it perfect for concealment, and equally perfect for an ambush. Crowe knew he had to be cautious. Kane thrived on traps. Night fell, and the desert transformed into a realm of shadows and whispers. Crowe's eyes adjusted to the darkness, his revolver at the ready. Every sound, the scrape of stone, the rustle of sand, the distant call of a desert fox, made him tense. He knew Kane was out there, moving silently, as cunning as ever. The sheriff crouched behind a boulder, listening. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a small figure darting between shadows on the ridge across the canyon. Human gait. Kane? Crowe mounted his horse silently and followed, taking care not to disturb the sand or leave tracks that could betray his path. The chase led him through narrow ridges where one false step could send a man plummeting into the canyon below. Each turn brought Crowe closer, but Kane had anticipated the pursuit. He had left smoke signals, false tracks, and subtle misdirections that slowed even a seasoned lawman. Hours later, Crowe arrived at Lone Pine, the ghost town. The buildings leaned precariously, windows broken, wooden beams sagging under the weight of time. The wind whistled through empty streets, carrying a hollow sound that could mask any footsteps. Crowe dismounted and moved cautiously, scanning every alley, doorway, and shadow. This town had become a chessboard, and Kane was the master of the game. A sudden clang echoed from the center of town. Crowe spun toward the sound, gun raised. A man stepped from the shadows, a bounty hunter also tracking Kane, his face half hidden by the brim of a worn hat. He did not lower his weapon. "You're in my territory, Sheriff," the man growled, voice low and threatening. Crowe understood immediately. Kane had anticipated not just him, but rival hunters and opportunists who sought the bounty. Each layer of the pursuit was calculated. To succeed, Crowe would need every ounce of patience, cunning, and foresight. He backed into the shadows, keeping the bounty hunter in sight. "We can work together, or apart," Crowe said evenly. The man sneered but made no move to attack. Crowe recognized it as Kane's signature tactic, turning potential allies or rivals into unwitting pawns. As the night deepened, Crowe settled into his vigil. He examined the ghost town with a meticulous eye, noting every structural weakness, every potential trap, every vantage point. He pieced together Kane's likely paths, his patterns of movement, and the psychology of a man who thrived on chaos. By the faint glow of dawn, Crowe had mapped a tentative route. He mounted his horse, checking his revolver and cartridge belts. The sheriff knew that Kane was clever, ruthless, and always one step ahead, but he also knew that no one was untouchable. The chase was far from over. And as the morning sun rose over the canyons, Crowe pushed onward, driven by a singular thought: he would catch Kane before the outlaw could vanish again, and justice would finally be served. The desert stretched endlessly before him, filled with danger, mystery, and the thrill of the hunt. Every ridge, every shadow, every broken board might conceal Kane, or his next deadly trap. This was only the second day of pursuit, and the stakes had never been higher. The cat-and-mouse game between Sheriff Elias Crowe and Vincent "Viper" Kane was entering a new, more perilous phase, and the frontier itself seemed to hold its breath. The morning sun rose over Silver Valley, its golden light reflecting off the windows of the town's saloons and wooden storefronts. The streets were alive with merchants opening shops, horses being tethered, and townsfolk greeting one another. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary frontier town. But beneath the calm, tension throbbed like a heartbeat. Sheriff Elias Crowe had arrived with his deputies, each man concealed behind barrels, posts, or the shadowed alleys of the main street. Crowe had spent the previous days piecing together clues, setting a trap, and sending false intelligence to surrounding towns. Rumors of a heist in Silver Valley had been spread intentionally, bait designed to lure Viper Kane into a predictable path. He had recruited trusted deputies, local ranchers, and a handful of townsfolk to assist. Every detail was calculated, every possibility had been considered. Kane, true to his reputation, took the bait. From a ridge outside town, he surveyed Silver Valley with a practiced eye. His grin was faint but knowing. He saw Crowe as cautious, methodical, and predictable, a man who followed logic and procedure. Kane thrived on exploiting such patterns. He signaled to his 3 men with a nod, and they descended into town with silent confidence, bags of stolen supplies already packed for their escape. Crowe's heart pounded as he watched from the shadows. The first shot was fired almost immediately, a warning to those who might interfere. Chaos erupted. Kane and his men darted between alleyways, using the town's architecture to shield themselves. Smoke bombs exploded in the streets, filling the air with dust and obscuring vision. Crowe moved swiftly, signaling his deputies to converge, but Kane's movements were uncanny. Each corner Crowe turned, each building he checked, Kane had anticipated. The gang's misdirection slowed the sheriff's progress, but he pressed forward, determined not to lose his quarry again. The townsfolk, hiding in doorways and behind fences, watched the spectacle with fear and fascination. Children peeked from behind barrels, women held their breath. Crowe felt the weight of their eyes, their hopes resting on him. This was more than a chase, it was a test of courage, wit, and endurance. In the midst of the chaos, one of Kane's men surrendered, hands raised in defeat. He was shaking, terrified, yet defiant. Crowe approached cautiously. "Where's Kane headed?" the sheriff demanded, his voice firm. The man spat on the dusty ground. "The mine, outside of town. That's his escape. But, it's rigged. Anyone follows, it'll collapse on them." Crowe's pulse quickened. A rigged mine was exactly the kind of trap Kane would set, ensuring he stayed ahead of the law. The sheriff considered his options carefully. There was no room for error. One misstep, one miscalculation, and the hunt would end, not with justice, but with death. He mounted his horse, signaling his deputies to follow cautiously. The path to the mine was treacherous, narrow ridges, loose rocks, and steep cliffs all designed to deter pursuit. Crowe slowed his pace, relying on observation and instinct rather than speed. Kane had always thrived in terrain like this, knowing every trick of the land. As the group approached the mine, the tension became palpable. Crowe could feel it in the air, a charged energy that made every shadow, every sound, feel like a threat. The entrance loomed ahead, dark, gaping, and ominous, with splintered beams hinting at the instability of the interior. Crowe dismounted and motioned for his men to stay back. He approached on foot, revolver ready, eyes scanning the darkness. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind through the mine entrance, kept him alert. Kane was clever, he could be anywhere, hiding, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Inside, the mine was a labyrinth of tunnels, low ceilings, and unstable walls. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by shafts of sunlight from cracks above. Crowe moved carefully, stepping lightly to avoid triggering any traps. His instincts were sharp, every sound, every echo told him something about the space around him. A faint metallic scrape echoed through the tunnel. Crowe froze. His finger hovered over the trigger. Kane's voice, calm and taunting, reached his ears. "Predictable, Sheriff, always one step behind." Crowe's eyes adjusted to the shadows, and he spotted movement, a glint of a revolver barrel, a shadow shifting along the wall. Kane was ahead, leading him into a game of patience and psychology. The sheriff circled slowly, keeping low, each step deliberate. This was no longer a chase, it was a battle of wits. Suddenly, Kane appeared in a cross-tunnel, gun raised. Crowe fired a warning shot, and the echo bounced back, blending with the sound of loose rocks falling. Kane ducked behind a pillar, firing in return. Bullets ricocheted off stone, and the mine seemed to vibrate with tension. Crowe advanced, moving carefully between shadows. Kane's strategy became clear, he intended to guide Crowe into a trap deeper within the mine. But Crowe was ready. He had anticipated this, studying Kane's patterns and psychological tendencies. Every decision Kane made, Crowe mirrored with caution. The mine's narrow corridors forced the 2 men into proximity, heightening the tension. They circled one another, each waiting for the other to make a critical mistake. Dust fell from the ceiling as the air grew thick, mixing with the smell of gunpowder. Every step was heavy with anticipation. At a fork in the tunnel, Kane made his move, darting to the left into a smaller shaft. Crowe pursued, barely noticing the subtle mechanism Kane had left, a loose beam poised to collapse under weight. But Crowe's keen observation allowed him to maneuver past the danger, the trap triggered safely behind him. The confrontation was escalating. Crowe's breathing was measured, Kane's smirk was visible in the dim light. They were now in a vast cavern, larger than any other part of the mine, with shafts and crevices forming a maze of potential death traps. Kane's cleverness had created a fortress of psychological and physical challenges, and Crowe had to remain focused to survive. With a careful plan forming in his mind, Crowe signaled his deputies, who cautiously followed behind. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown, a confrontation that would decide who would emerge victorious in this deadly game of pursuit. The tension, the anticipation, and the stakes could not have been higher. The frontier itself seemed to hold its breath. Every creaking beam, every shifting shadow, every echo could conceal danger, or the final opportunity to end the hunt. Sheriff Elias Crowe tightened his grip on his revolver, heart steady but mind alert. He knew the final confrontation with Vincent "Viper" Kane was imminent, and that only one of them would leave the mine alive, or unbroken. The mine's mouth yawned like the entrance to a shadowed underworld, jagged rocks casting long, menacing silhouettes in the dim morning light. Sheriff Elias Crowe dismounted cautiously, each step deliberate, boots crunching softly on loose gravel. The air smelled of damp earth and dust, mixed with the faint tang of gunpowder lingering from the earlier skirmishes. Crowe's heart beat steadily, but beneath it lay a pulse of tension, the kind that came when life and death hung by a single thread. Inside, the mine was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and low tunnels. Stalactites jutted from the ceiling, shadows twisting in the flickering shafts of sunlight piercing through cracks above. Every footfall echoed ominously, amplifying the silence between shots and whispers. Crowe's eyes adjusted to the gloom, searching, calculating, anticipating. He could sense Kane somewhere ahead, waiting, patient and lethal. "Kane," Crowe called, voice steady, echoing against stone walls. "It ends here." From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, tall, lean, confident. Vincent "Viper" Kane emerged, revolver in hand, his signature smirk curling across his face. His eyes sparkled with defiance, the same gleam that had haunted the dreams of lawmen and townsfolk alike. "You're predictable, Sheriff," Kane said, voice low but deliberate. "Always one step behind. And now, you've followed me into my playground." Crowe didn't flinch. He had anticipated Kane's psychological tactics, his reliance on misdirection, his hunger for dominance. The two men began circling each other, slowly, like predators in a cage. Dust fell from the ceiling, stirred by subtle drafts and careful footwork. Every creak, every shift of gravel, every small movement was amplified in the silent cavern. Kane fired first. The report of the revolver echoed violently, ricocheting off stone. Crowe dove behind a low boulder, bullets chipping rock around him. He returned fire, the sharp crack of gunfire cutting through the dense air. Each shot was calculated, measured, precise. Neither man was willing to risk a hasty mistake. The mine's narrow corridors became their battlefield. Kane's knowledge of the tunnels gave him an advantage, but Crowe's patience and strategy countered it. He noted subtle cues, the way dust fell from a ceiling crack, the faint sound of Kane's boot against loose stones. Each observation gave him insight, each misstep Kane made provided opportunity. Suddenly, Kane dashed toward a side shaft, intending to use a hidden crevice to flank Crowe. Anticipating this, Crowe fired a well-aimed shot, grazing Kane's shoulder. Kane stumbled but regained his balance with a wicked grin. Crowe's eyes narrowed, he was close, but Kane had one final trick. A subtle shift in the mine's structure indicated a potential collapse. Crowe realized Kane had rigged the tunnels, designed to funnel pursuers into a deadly trap. The sheriff moved cautiously, triggering the first cave-in in a controlled manner. Dust and debris tumbled down a side shaft, blocking Kane's intended escape path without harming anyone. The plan was working, but time was critical. Kane paused, assessing Crowe's movements. His grin faded, replaced by a sharp focus. "You think you've outsmarted me," he hissed, taking a step closer. Crowe's revolver remained steady. "It ends today," he replied, voice calm but resolute. The two men circled within the vast cavern, a tense standoff heightened by the echo of dripping water and distant wind whistling through the mine's fissures. Shadows flickered across their faces, revealing determination, fear, and the raw edge of survival instincts. Kane lunged suddenly, firing as he moved. Crowe rolled to the side, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls, striking stalagmites and sending shards of rock clattering to the ground. The tension was suffocating. One misstep, one premature shot, and the confrontation could end in death for either of them. Finally, Crowe feigned a move to the left, baiting Kane forward. Kane took the bait, stepping into the narrowest part of the tunnel. Crowe seized the opportunity, raising his revolver and firing with pinpoint precision. Kane fell to the ground, the echo of the shot lingering long after silence returned. Crowe approached cautiously, gun still aimed. Kane's smirk had vanished, replaced by a mixture of defeat and disbelief. "So, it ends, like this?" Kane muttered, voice barely audible. Crowe lowered his gun slightly. "It ends because justice must," he said. "The frontier will remain dangerous, but your reign of terror ends here." The townsfolk of Silver Valley, who had followed Crowe cautiously, emerged as he exited the mine. Relief swept over the crowd as they realized the hunt was over. Children ran into the streets, mothers embraced one another, and deputies cheered silently behind barrels and posts. Kane's gang, now leaderless and demoralized, scattered into the desert, disappearing into the horizon with the rising sun. Crowe walked through the streets, weary but resolute. Justice had been served, but he knew the Wild West was never truly tamed. Outlaws would rise again, danger would return, and the game would start anew. Yet today, order had been restored, even if only temporarily. The sheriff paused at the edge of town, looking toward the horizon where the desert met the sky. Dust swirled in the wind, catching the morning light, and he felt the weight of the frontier on his shoulders. Every town, every homestead, every canyon carried stories of fear, courage, and survival. And Crowe knew he was part of that tapestry, a lone figure ensuring that law, however fragile, endured. With a final glance toward the town, he mounted his horse, ready to ride onward. In the Wild West, law and crime dance in a deadly rhythm, and only the cleverest survive.